Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, reviewing today this sword named Shaliah from Winter Cutlery. Now, you may not be familiar with the name Winter Cutlery. It is a one-man shop run by Eric Estlund, and he's not somebody who has produced a ton of swords that people are aware of. He does have a good number available on his website. He takes commissions, I believe, but his name's not really out there to the wide sword buying public that I'm aware of, at least. To help remedy that and to get feedback and just more opinions, he has sent this sword along with two others to me for review. He has also shipped a couple to my friend Andy over at Dlatrex to do his normal videos on. Now, these are all loaners. We do have to send them back to Eric. But this will help him get, like I said, he would like some feedback from people, but he also wants to get his name out there. And this sword does come with a scabbard, and that package together is $4,000. We'll talk more about that price when I get towards the end of this review and talk about the bottom line. So this sword, the Shaliah, is a Type 17, which was a sword that saw use in the 14th and 15th centuries. It is characterized by having a stout hexagonal cross-section, oftentimes a short fuller in it, quite a bit of profile taper, two-handed grip that could probably also be used one-handed. And one of the primary design ideas behind that stiff blade is half swording and being able to get into the gaps in armor. However, depending on the breadth of the blade, they could also deliver cuts as well. And this one, Eric told me, he kind of designed it as a war sword, one that you would take to war because it is big and it is powerful. Now, of the oakshot types, 17 is one of the least commonly reproduced on the market by pretty much everybody. In fact, the only people that I know are actively making Type 17s is Albion. They have two different models, the Sempak and the Landgraf. And they have a very different take on the Type 17. It's hexagonal, but they are much more light, nimble, and much more what I would consider dueling swords, whereas this one is more of a sword of war. The scabbard that Eric included with this sword is relatively simple at first glance, with a few embossed lines that match the shape on the crossguard and a steel shape on the scabbard. Now, this has some extra decorations on it. These little ropes here were, according to the listing, were handmade, and by looking at them, I can tell that they were brazed on to the shape. It gives it a unique look. This is not a shape design I've seen before. And overall, the fit is excellent. There's no rattle like this. A little bit like this, you're not going to hear it, but I can feel it. And if I hold it upside down, it very gently slides out. Very gently, slowly. So that's a good fit. It could be tighter, but frankly, I think that's a very good fit. If you didn't notice, that's also a very smooth draw and sheath, because the inside is lined with felt. And one thing I really like is that the mouth of the scabbard the felt extends onto the mouth, so you don't even see any of the wood core on here. It's overall a very nicely done scabbard. It matches the sword very well, and it looks good, it feels good, and it fits good. Moving on to the hilt, let's start with the pommel. This would be what I would consider a variant of a Type G pommel, which a Type G is generally going to be a circular pommel with a bit of doming to it. And this one has a little bit of flattening on both ends, right, like that. Very minor difference, but it does give it a little bit more depth and dimension. The doming on here is very, very slight, but it is there. And there is some dimension to the thickness, where it starts a tiny bit thicker at the grip and tapers in thickness just a little bit towards the peen. The peen is very cleanly done. You don't see really any errant hammer marks. Everything's been cleaned up. It's all overall It's a robust peen, and it's very nicely done. One thing that's really cool is that I don't think I've seen on any other maker's work is that Eric put his maker's mark on the pommel, not on the sword. You can see that right here. That's just something different. You know, like I said, I haven't seen that on any other sword, at least any other reproduction. I don't recall seeing that on any historical swords, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were some. Now the finish on the pommel is pretty shiny. I can see my face in it. It's a little bit blurry, but there's also some depth to the polish. I don't really know how to describe this, but you can see the doming in the polish. And it's very subtle, and I doubt you'll be able to see it on any camera, but in person, I can see the way it domes in the polish, which gives it a nice attention to detail. It's something that more to look at when you're just picking up the sword and looking at it. It's also a very comfortable pommel if you happen to like wheel pommels to grip or hold on to, because all the corners are chamfered over very nicely. It can, if I grip it like around there, it can slide along the palm very easily without any interference. And if I take it and grip it in two hands, I can certainly just grip it like that, but I could also move my grip down, put the pommel in my palm, and it's very comfortable like that as well. The grip is pretty long. This is, in my opinion, definitely a two-handed grip, as I just demonstrated. I can easily get two hands on it without even touching the pommel, or I can separate my hands and get more grip, get more leverage by spreading the hands. The leather on here is dyed a brown, and it's a good-looking leather. It's a good-looking dye. It's very even. There's a cord wrap texture on here, very crisp risers in all dimensions. The seam is very unnoticeable. I had to really look for it to find the seam. Once I found it, I was able to find it again pretty easily, but I don't feel it at all. The shaping, it's elliptical here with no taper in this dimension, and then it does swell out in all dimensions to this middle riser, and then it goes more towards cylindrical on the bottom half. Now, what I find is that this grip shape is not quite right for my hand. It's a good grip shape. It works for some people, but in my hand, I can kind of twist it around a little bit. For my hands, I would like to see either this widened just a hair or these surfaces flattened just a hair. Either one of those, I think, would get it to really rest in my hand a little more comfortably. But this is not a criticism of this sword. This is just a grip shape that doesn't quite work for me personally. I would say the crossguard is a type 6 that is mostly straight. It has a little bit of an upsweep to it, but very, very minor. The quillins do taper in thickness from, it's really hard to see from the center to the ends of the quillins, but they do taper, and the corners are chamfered, although these are a little crisper than the pommel, but that's okay because you're not going to really be gripping there. Not with the rain flap, rain shape, whatever you want to call it here. So let's talk about that. One of the things I love about these is you can thumb the blade easier by doing this with this shape, and it doesn't get your finger all over the blade. Less chance of corrosion, of rust, of that oil from your fingers getting on the blade and you having to worry about that. I really like that. And one thing that's interesting, I haven't seen a ton of swords with these shapes on here. This is one of the only ones I've seen that's this stiff. Most of the time when you get these, they are pretty floppy. These ones stay in position pretty well. And that's not the stiffest ones he's sent me. I have another sword from him that has this also, and I can't even really move those at all. Just something that's kind of interesting. The gap where the sword meets the blade is very, very minor. I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but it's there. You can definitely see it. It could be improved, but it'd be kind of ridiculous to ask it to be improved. You could, but it's extra time, extra effort, extra cost for something that you're not even going to see most of the time because of this shape. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So as you can see, this sword starts out at around 6 millimeters and definitely has some distal taper in it, although it stays pretty robust throughout the blade. That's to help it maintain that stiffness, rigidity, and to give it more power. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the design goals of this sword was a sword of war, something that could deliver really powerful cuts, could be half-sworded well, but at the same time is still functional in one hand. I'll talk about that in a minute during the handling section. The hexagonal cross-section on here is beautiful. It's really well done, very even lines. They're not super crisp. Like on a katana, you'll often see that transition being very crisp and incredibly well defined. It's not like that on here. This is a softer transition, but it is very evenly done, very nice and smoothed over very well. The fuller is pretty wide, goes about a third of the way up the blade and ends very close to the same spot on both sides. The edge beveling is from the end of that hexagonal cross section to the edge, very much one single bevel. There is what I would consider a micro bevel where the final sharpening was done. That's very normal to see. And overall, the finish on the sword blade is excellently done. There's very tiny signs of unevenness in the surface of the blade if you look super close. But it's very, very hard to see. I doubt you'll even see those tiny, I hesitate to even call them ripples, but I doubt you'll even be able to see them in the video I'm showing because they are very, very minor. But overall, the finish is a soft satin, a look that I like. It is a little bit shinier than a full-on satin, but it's nowhere near as reflective as a true mirror. It's evenly done, and it is quite attractive. And I also have to say, the profile of this sword, there's something right about it. I don't know how better to describe it. It just looks right. It looks authentic to swords of this type. It just has something that you look at it, I look at it and say, yeah, that looks right. I think Mr. Estlund nailed the overall profile of this sword. Now the edge, like I said, there is definitely signs of final sharpening. There's very much a micro bevel on here. It's not crazy sharp. It's sharp. It's sharp enough to cut, but it's definitely not hair popping sharp. I don't think it's even paper cutting sharp, but that's by design. The way Mr. Estlund put it to me, he put an edge on it, but he didn't put a crazy edge because this is more of a war sword. You know, if you have a super sharp edge, it might not maintain that edge as you're taking it to war. So a little bit more of robust of an edge was the idea he put behind it. In addition, one of the design goals was a sword that was really good for half swording. Now, when you're half swording a blade, you know, you're gripping it on the flats and really gripping it on those flats and not actually interacting with the edge. But your hands are going to slip some. It's inevitable. So a really crazy sharp edge could be dangerous to the user. Now, if you're doing it right, it's really not much of an issue if it's crazy sharp. But I get why he would not put that final pop on the edge if you were going to be half sorting quite a bit. Let's move on to cutting. Now, I took this to the backyard and did my typical targets of water bottles, different varying types of plastic, some paper containers, that kind of thing. I did not do tatami, but I don't think this would really be a very good sword to cut tatami with because it's not really designed for competition cutting or that kind of cutting that requires a really sharp edge, because that's not what this was intended for. It can cut. It's not a great cutter, but it can definitely cut. When my edge alignment is on, I'm able to get pretty decent cuts. When my edge alignment was a little off or I didn't get the tip accelerating enough, it didn't really deliver very good or satisfying cuts. Now, because it is balanced quite far out from the guard for what I'm used to, I did struggle to accelerate the tip and to really get a whole lot of good cuts. I had a few in there where I really did get the sword going and it delivered satisfying cuts. Probably my best one was on this milk jug, the second cut. And you can see what happened there, right into the post. My accuracy was awful here, but it was actually a good cut. And as you can see, I checked the straightness after that cut, and it stayed completely straight and true. It sprung back to true after bending and driving into the wood there. No edge deformation at all. The sword handled that perfectly, and that's what you want to see. Moving on to the handling of the sword, I'm going to just demonstrate a few things for you. The point of balance is relatively far out from the guard. It's around 6 inches if I remember right. You can see there, pretty far out. It is a pretty stiff blade, but it does have some flex towards the tip. And the percussion note on the blade looks like it's right around there. I had it on my graphics, so you'll know what the actual measurement is, but it looks like it's around there. And in the hilt, right where you want it, right in this upper part of the grip, right where your hand's gripping it, exactly where I like to have that feel. So this is not a light and nimble sword, at least for me. It has, with that forward point of balance, a pretty decent weight. It's not overly heavy, but it's got some heft to it. And with that forward point of balance, this sword has a lot of authority in the cut. And it's not something that I find particularly easy to accelerate the tip. I can do it when I'm really paying attention, but then usually what I find, this is me personally, when I have to pay that much attention to accelerating the tip and really getting that initial tip velocity, what I find is that the rest of my mechanics start going out of whack. I start missing out on them. So if I'm really focusing on getting that initial tip velocity, I'll end up, oftentimes my arms don't get all the way straight, my hips don't engage. That's a large part of that is going to be my failings as a swordsman. But it is something to be aware of. If you happen to cut similarly to me, you might theoretically also struggle to get the mechanics really nailed in. Now, that's not to say this is clunky or bad or anything like that. These are my failings with this sword. Just picking this up, moving it around. It moves correctly. It moves slower than I like, but it moves the way a sword should move. It's just slower than I tend to like. It requires better technique than I tend to like. It's also more tiring than I tend to like, because that forward point of balance really means you have to put more effort. I have to put more effort into my cuts and into handling it, so it tires me out quicker than perhaps a nimbler, faster sword. Now let's check sword wind here. Definitely has some sword wind there. I don't know if you heard it over the sound of my wrist cracking there. Getting old, man. Every joint creaks and cracks all the time. But it does have some sword wind. It's not crazy loud, but it's there. And if you're in a quiet enough environment, you will definitely hear it when your edge alignment is on. So one thing that I find really interesting about this sword is the tip control. It's more, I have more control over it than I would think I would with that point of balance. And that, I don't have perfect control over it. I've never had a sword that I have perfect control over the tip. But this has really good tip control. And that surprises me, because usually when you have a sword with that far out point of balance, tip control suffers. And it gets harder to deliver it where you want the tip to go. I don't find that to be a problem here. Even like that was an awkward thrust, but it went exactly where I wanted to go. And I don't expect that with a sword with this far out point of balance. That is a testament to Eric's craftsmanship, and even more than his craftsmanship, his ability to design this sword to handle well. That's not something that very many craftspeople would get right, in my opinion. So unfortunately, I don't have any swords to compare this to. Even with my arsenal, I don't really have any swords that handle even remotely similarly to this, or anything that is designed to handle somewhat similarly or with a similar design goal. The closest I was thinking is I have a custom Albion Type 17, but like I said, it's customized. The whole hilt has been redone. And honestly, like I mentioned earlier, Albion's Type 17s are a wildly different design goal than this one. Eric's design goal with this was war sword, powerful cutter with still tip control. Half swording, this is something I forgot to mention. He really wanted to focus on a sword that you can half sword with. Now, I have no experience half swording, but what I can say is if I grip it like with the bottom, oh yeah, easy to move it around. Once I try to switch to a top grip, I don't know what I'm doing like this. And it doesn't, I mean, I guess if I'm just doing like that, I can see how it's usable, but I'm not experienced with half sorting, but like I said, if I'm just trying to do like yeah, that feels right with this sword. That absolutely does. And I think I mentioned this earlier, Eric's design goal here with the edge was to put an edge on it so that it can cut, but not so sharp that it would be dangerous to half sword. And when I'm holding it like that, again, I don't have really any experience with half swording. I understand the technique where you're gripping the flats of the blade, leaving a gap between the blade and your actual hand so you're not endangering your fingers. I can get that, but I can also see why you would want to not make it razor sharp so that you don't risk yourself. All right, bottom line. The asking price for this sword and scabbard is $4,000. You don't need me to tell you that that is a lot of money. What do you get for that? Well, you get a sword that is very clearly inspired by originals, especially one of the things Mr. Estlund likes to do is view original artwork and use that to inspire him, both on the swords and on the scabbards. And it shows here. This sword, there's something about it that just feels authentic. But $4,000. What can you get for that in the sword collecting world? Well, you could get a dozen windless swords. You could get 2 to 3 Albions. You could get something from somebody like Mateusz Solowski, Damian Solowski, some of these other really well-known and very well-regarded smiths. So if you look at this as Mr. Estlund being a peer of the Solowskis or say Todd's Workshop, swords that and scabbards that retail in this price range, how does he compare to those? Well, the decoration is on the scabbard, especially on this one, is definitely less than you'll get from, say, the Solowskis. But there's also a little bit more historical accuracy to my eye here. This sword just pops that historical authenticity a little bit more than the Solowskis especially. So $4,000, is it worth that price? Well, this one, for me, no. But I have to caveat that because I'm not really the target for this sword. I don't really like swords of war. You know, I like swords that I can take into the backyard and have fun cutting with. And this is just not that sword. But if this is the type of sword you like, if this is what you want, then yes, I could see this being worth it. I don't have a compunction about spending $4,000 on a sword. I have several in my collection that are roughly that price range, somewhere around there. And it's because they really spoke to me. If that's what you want, if this is a sword that really speaks to you, it can be worth it. I personally would not want to buy this sword for $4,000, but I can see how somebody would want to. I already have an idea of a sword that I might want to commission from Mr. Estlund, but I don't know. That's just kind of vague thoughts. And I'm not sure if I would want to do that or not. All that being said, yes, this sword can be worth the price. There's some people who are going to say, no, it's not. No sword is worth that price. And that's their right. Nobody is forcing anybody to buy swords for this price. But at the same time, who am I to tell Mr. Estlund or the Solowskis or Todd of Todd's Workshop, any of them, what their time is worth? Mr. Estlund priced this so that the time he spent on it, he can sell it at a price that's worth that time. And I am not going to tell him that his time is not worth what he thinks it is. it just may not be worth it for me to buy this specific sword. But I could see myself buying something at this rough price point from Mr. Estlund if it was exactly what I wanted. And that's going to wrap up this review. I want to say a huge thank you to Mr. Eric Estlund for loaning me this sword, as well as the 2 others that he sent. Those are going to be reviewed in the coming 2 months, I believe it is. So make sure you stick around and look for those. If you haven't, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, like button, all that YouTube stuff. Until next time, Alien Tude out.